بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the second lesson of the first semester of the Usul program that we're doing here. You've now been sufficiently introduced to the topic of Usul. We know sort of what we're getting into. So it's now time to dive into some of the actual principles. We now actually get to look at how to derive rulings. So inshallah, the exciting stuff starts now, or the boring stuff, depending on how you want to look at it. I'm joking. Anyway, so to begin, as I maybe have mentioned before, this term we're going to be focusing on the Kitabullah. If you recall, Usul is made up, the subject matters of Usul were the four sources of Sharia. So Quran, Kitabullah, Sunnah of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Ijma' and Qiyas. So that's the subjects, what Usul is broken down into, because each one of those has unique principles associated to them. So this semester we'll be focusing specifically on Kitabullah, and we'll be looking at principles in relation to deriving rulings from Kitabullah. So inshallah there'll be a short introduction to that in this lesson, and then we'll move on to some of the actual principles, specifically in terms of when you look at looking at sentences in terms of their linguistic designation, or what the dictionary definition means for the words in the sentence. So when you have a sentence of the Quran, what do the dictionary meanings of the terms tell you, and how do we deal with that? Inshallah, this is very abstract what I've explained to you now. In the lesson it will make more sense, inshallah. And with that, I just want to mention some initial, some things to understand before the lesson. First of all, usul is a very abstract topic. It can come across as very abstract. And what I mean by that is there's principles and concepts that you've never really thought of, and you have to think about them in a way. You have to think, there's concepts that you've probably never come across before, and I'm going to be trying to explain these concepts in a way that it will kind of be all very new to you, and your brain has to kind of think in a way that it might not necessarily be used to thinking. I remember my first usul lesson, it was just like, oh, okay, what is all of this? You're kind of at sea, and then gradually as you do a few more lessons, it kind of all makes sense, because you kind of begin to understand which way we're kind of looking at everything. But in the beginning, because you've never really looked at everything before, unless you're a language analyst, or you kind of analyze law, or I don't know. I'm not sure how these subjects, I'm not sure if these subjects are similar to usul or not, because I've never studied them, but I've studied usul. So usul is a very abstract topic, and even in Arabic it's abstract, but then we're trying to explain this in English without the Arabic, so it can come across a bit more abstract. So even in Arabic, when you learn usul in Arabic, the language is a bit difficult. So trying to break that down in English, inshallah, there's a few ways that I'm going to be able to try and do that, try and break it down and make it easy. But I'm just giving you this forewarning that, it's going to require a lot of mental energy, inshallah. But again, that's not a challenge that we should back down from. And obviously it's also on me to try and simplify it. So inshallah, that is what I've endeavored to do. So because of that, I might explain things in multiple ways to try and make it make sense for everyone. And I hope that doesn't make it tedious or boring. And of course, I can't get feedback from you guys because this is a video. So, inshallah, we do our best. So I think with that, we can move on. There was one other thing in my head, but it's not coming to me right now. So inshallah, I'll explain it. I'll mention it if it comes across to me in the lesson. But yeah, so with that, hopefully I haven't scared everybody off. Let's start the lesson, inshallah. Okay, so let's begin. So we start off with the Kitabullah, the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. because as I said, this semester will be focusing on the Kitabullah and how to take rulings from the Kitabullah. So, first of all, we need to define what the Kitabullah is. And you might think, oh, the Kitabullah is the Quran. You know, we have this Mus'haf. I don't have one on me right now here, but we have a Mus'haf and all the words in there, that's Kitabullah, it's the Quran, you know, and there's no doubt about that. And yes, you're 100% correct. But we'll see exactly why we needed to define it when I go through the definition. So, how have they defined the Kitabullah? There's four main parts to this definition. So the first one is that the Kitabullah is the Quran, right? As you're probably thinking, of course, Kitabullah is the Quran, right? However, when you say Quran, that's not necessarily specific enough. Because, for example, there may have been verses in the Quran which are no longer part of the Quran, i.e. they were abrogated. For example, well, I can't think of an example off the top of my head right now, but actually there is an example. The verse in regards to Rajam, I believe, was abrogated, so it's no longer recited. And there are other verses as well. Also, off the top of my head, I recall that I'm not sure if this is an opinion or if this is definite, but I've definitely heard that the dua of qunut that we recite in witr, the dua of qunut that Hanafis recite in witr, Allahumma inna nasta'inuka wa nastaghfiruka, that dua. So that dua I heard was part of the Quran. I remember reading that somewhere, and was later abrogated. So just as an example, there are verses that were initially part of the Quran and were later abrogated. So now the question is, does the Quran include those, or does our definition, are we dealing with those verses or are we not? Right? When we define Quran, does it include those or not? And then there's also some verses which the Sahaba differed about. So some Sahaba said this was part of the Quran and some said it wasn't. Right? And again, the dominant opinion now is that whatever's in our Mus'haf is what is in the Quran. But how did we get to that? We need a definition in order to get to that. So the definition of Kitabullah, Quran, right? But as I said, that's not specific enough. So we need to be more specific, and so when you say Quran, all of these things come in, including what we want, but then some other things are also within that definition which we don't want, and we need to exclude them by making our definition slightly more specific. So we say it's the Quran al-munazzalu ala Rasulillah. First of all, it is the Quran which was revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And again, we shouldn't have to say this, but just in order to be specific, because let's say somebody else wrote a book and called it the Quran, right? So that would not be included in this definition. However, when we say that the book of Allah is the Quran, then there's that possibility, because this book is also called the Quran. So just to be specific, again, practically nobody's actually going to realistically think that, but definitions have to be precise. So the Quran, which was revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So now any other book called the Quran, I'm not even sure if one exists, but if there was, then that's now out of the definition. The third part of the definition is al-maktubu fil masahif. So it is the Quran which was revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and now this third one, the one that was recorded in the mushafs. And the reason why is because there was two major compilations of the Quran into a mushaf. So one was done by Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, one was done by Uthman radiallahu anhu. And so effectively, anything that made it into those compilations, we're saying that is what we mean by the Quran. And anything that was taken out, we're saying is now excluded. So now any abrogated verses or any other, anything that there was some doubt over, oh, this was revealed and they used to recite it, but maybe it became abrogated or whatever. So anything like that, if it was part of the Mus'haf, if the Sahaba considered it part of the Mus'haf when they compiled it, then that's what we mean. That's the Quran, and that's part of it. Otherwise, it goes out of our definition. And then the final one is that it has to be transmitted from the Prophet ﷺ to us in an unbroken chain which is continuous and contiguous with no possibility of error. And I'll explain that in a bit more detail in a second. But we can see that, so this, well, I'll explain it now actually. So this mushaf, so obviously the Quran was compiled into different mushafs. Uthman radiallahu anh compiled it and sent them around. But before that, other Sahaba had different mushafs, right? Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anh famously had his own mushaf, right? His own collection of what he said was of what was the Quran according to him. Not according to him as in it was the Quran, right? But then Uthman radiallahu anh finalized it, and this is a discussion that you can have in Usul al-Tafsir inshallah when you go into that. So we're only considering the usulis. They said we're only going to consider those mushafs and those verses which have been transmitted to us in a unbroken continuous chain, which is continuous, i.e. it's continuous from us to them, i.e. it doesn't end at somebody else. It doesn't end and the other way, it doesn't end like a few generations earlier. So it's a continuous unbroken chain. This person recited the whole Quran to this person, who recited to this person, who recited to this person. That's an unbroken continuous chain, and it goes from, let's say, myself until all the way to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So that's a continuous and unbroken chain. But it also has to be contiguous with no possibility of error, in that so many different people narrated it that it's impossible that there is any error within it. So it's mass transmitted. So there's not only one chain like this, there are thousands of chains or hundreds of chains, to the extent that it's impossible, inconceivable that there was any change that took place between us and them. In other words, we have absolute certainty. We have absolute certainty that this is the same transmission that the Prophet ﷺ recited to the Sahaba. So that's what we mean when we say Quran. So this would exclude any other readings of the Quran which may not have been as mass transmitted, what they call the shadh qira'at or the shadh readings, etc. And just an example, the qira'ah of Ibn Mas'ud there's one example I remember where in the verse of kafara, so I can't remember which kafara it was, but it's fast for, is it 30 days or 3 days, or is it 10 days? Siyamu asharati, إطعام عشرة مساكين فصيام شهرين متتابعين. Okay, I can't remember. But anyway, the word is mutatabi'at. He had the word mutatabi'at in addition, and I can check it. It's just in this book, but I don't want to waste your time. So he had this extra word which is not found in our mushafs. So now, is that part of the Quran or not? That's the question. So this is a discussion that we have. And again, I don't think we'll cover it in this term, but maybe in a later usul course, if you do, maybe in a later module in a later year, we'll cover usul in more detail. Then this will come up. But so things like this will now be excluded because of our condition of it being transmitted in a continuous, contiguous fashion with no possibility of error. So that's the Quran, that's the Kitabullah, that's what we mean by Kitabullah. Now the end result is our mushaf that we have, that is what it is, right? Our mushaf, what the verses contained in our mushaf is effectively what this definition results in, right? Now you can understand now why we had to explain this by the next point, which is, what's the ruling of the Quran, right? So the rulings that are found in the Quran, what do we say about them? So if the Quran says to pray, what does that mean, right? Well, first of all, we know that the ruling of the Quran is that it's necessary to follow, right? And that also applies to everything else. like the Sunnah as well, is necessary to follow. But the Quran has a higher ruling, because the Quran, we say, is a definitive source. So when we said that it has to have no possibility of error and it has to be continuous, contiguous, and all of that, that's all to establish that this Quran is completely, it's definitive. It is definitely the same Quran that was recited by the Prophet ﷺ, right? And then when we have established that, we now say that the rulings in this Quran are also definitive, right? So the Quran is definitively established by the Prophet ﷺ, which is definitively established from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, revealed to him from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once we've established that this connection exists in a definitive sense, the rulings contained therein are also definitive, definite, 100% true and accurate. So if the Quran says to pray, that is a definitive ruling, right? There is no doubt about that. So that means that we cannot change that ruling. So for example, if we found a hadith somewhere, this doesn't exist, but let's just, for a thought experiment, right? Say that a hadith existed and it said something contrary to that. It said, okay, you don't have to pray, right? Or it's optional, or it's only for this, or, let's just hypothetically, again, this is not true, but let's just hypothetically say that. Because we know that the Quran was established through a definitive source, the only way you can alter this definitive source, or you can have something change this definitive source in any way, or change this definitive ruling in any way, is to have another definitive ruling. So you'd have to have another source of definitive, definite knowledge, and only then would you be able to give that source some weight when compared against the Quran. And we'll understand this more in today's lesson when we talk about some of the principles that we'll talk about, inshallah. So the takeaway from this is that the Quran is a definitive source, and the rulings contained therein are usually definitive, right? Which means that if it's a clear, specific ruling from the Quran, so for example, if the Quran says pray, then that is a clear, definitive ruling, and it requires, and in order to specify that or say that this is not applicable in some cases or anything like that, you're going to need another definitive source in order to do that. For example, another verse of the Quran, right, in order to clarify this ruling. So you can't just take qiyas, for example. So qiyas, analogy, is not a definitive ruling. It is still a ruling which is necessary to follow. So if an analogy says that, gives us, if we have a ruling based on analogy, it's still necessary to follow, but it's not definitive, right? It's speculative. It's what we call dhanni, right? Versus qat'i. Qat'i means definitive, definite. So effectively, if you have a ruling which is not definitive, which is speculative, you can overrule or alter or specify that ruling with another speculative or dhanni source. But if you have a ruling which is definitive, like the Quran, like something from the Quran, then you can't change that unless you have another definitive source. That's the general rule, and we'll look at this in more detail, inshallah. So we have this Quran, this Mus'haf. This Mus'haf contains chapters and sentences, but we know it's full of rulings because the Quran is the primary source of rulings in Sharia. And obviously this semester we're going to be looking at principles for deriving rulings from the Quran. So let's get into that discussion. Now, these principles come under four main categories. There's four main categories. The first of them is what we'll be discussing today, inshallah. And also, so we'll be discussing just the first one today. So what is this category? So the first category is looking at the rulings of the Quran from a linguistic perspective, from their linguistic designation, باعتبار الوضع. So the sentence is, so if you have a rule, let me backtrack a bit, right? So the Quran, as I said, is sentences. It's it's a book. It has chapters, and at the fundamental level, it's words and sentences. And the rulings that we derive from the Quran will be derived from a sentence in the Quran, an ayah, or a part of an ayah, etc. Now, how we look at that sentence, obviously we know. So if a sentence says, indeed we have, uh, you know, um, Salah has been made necessary upon the believers at specific times. That's a sentence in the Quran. And we know that, okay, Salah is made necessary. The point is, we can deduce, because that sentence is what was in the Quran, how that sentence has been said affects the ruling. So the principles that we're going to be explaining are all to do with looking at how the sentence has been said and trying to see how that affects the ruling, right? And that's kind of why this is also abstract. So as I said, the first category of principles is باعتبار الوضع, so the linguistic designation. So this sentence in the Quran, which contains this ruling, right? What does the dictionary definition of those words imply about the ruling? So linguistically, what do the words refer to, ignoring how the word may be used, right? So obviously sometimes there are cases where words aren't used in their linguistic meaning, right? So for example, if you use a word as a metaphor, he was a lion of a man, then the dictionary meaning of lion isn't going to really help you with that sentence because you've not used the word in the linguistic meaning. But that's a discussion for another day, inshallah. That will come. But for now, we're looking at sentences of the Quran according to their linguistic definitions or their linguistic designations. And the first principle under this category is khas, that words which are khas. What does khas mean? Khas is something specific. Khas is a word which is specific or refers to an individual, single specific thing, right? And the opposite of that is am, which is something which is universal. So universal, it refers to a category or a group of single specific objects, right? And these phrases are, kind of assume that you know logic or mantiq, right? Which I'm assuming many of you might not have studied before, and so that's kind of why they start off so abstract and there's a bit of a jump. But inshallah, we'll deal with that, and we'll explain it in a way where it's still easy to understand. Right. So the first principle is to do with words mentioned in the Quran, or when the sentence in the Quran refers to something specific, something single and specific, right? So specific kind of has the meaning of single inside it, where it's referring to one specific thing. So for example, if I say to you, bring me dessert versus bring me ice cream. So when I say bring me dessert is a word which is universal. It can refer to multiple single specific objects, right? Whereas if I said bring me ice cream, then ice cream is a single object, right? It's a single concept. When I say ice cream, you have to bring me an ice cream. It can't be anything else. Whereas a dessert can be ice cream, it can be cookie dough. Dessert is a category. Ice cream is specific. So the principle here was khas, right? Specific objects, single specific things. So if the Quran mentioned ice cream, that would be a reference to something specific and something khas. But if the Quran had mentioned desserts, then that would not be under this ruling. That would be am, that would be universal. That we'll cover that in a bit, inshallah. But first, single specific objects. So what happens when something single, when something specific is mentioned? So the ruling is that you can't further specify. So the Quran, as I said, the Quran is a definitive source, right? So the Quran has mentioned this ruling related to this specific thing. Now you can't, now the Quran's chosen to be specific. So you can't come and be more specific or generalize and make that more universal unless you have something of equivalent strength in Sharia. So let me just say this in other words. The Quran is definitive, and the Quran has definitively said that this ruling applies to this ruling. It has definitively mentioned this ruling, and it's mentioned that this ruling refers to this specific thing. Now, if you want to come and say that, if you want to come and make this more universal, right, and say that actually this also applies in this ruling and not just this specific thing, then you need to have another source of definitive and definite knowledge. Right, that was very abstract. So let's look at an example. Now remember I said, bring me a dessert. If I said to you, and I know I'm not the Quran, but go with me. If I said to you, bring me a dessert. So you went and you bought me, a dessert. Now you have the option when you go to the ice cream shop of bringing me any dessert, anything that comes under the meaning of dessert. So you can bring me ice cream, cookie dough, mojito, milkshake, anything. But if I said to you, bring me ice cream, now you have to bring me only this one thing. Now, if you go to the store, and you decide you're going to bring me something else, or you say that actually, maybe you go with my brother, and my brother thinks he knows me, and he said, oh yeah, he said to bring him ice cream, but he also likes cookie dough. So if you buy him cookie dough, it'll be fine, right? Now, what you've done there is you've now generalized the ruling. You've now made the ruling more universal. So I had said I want something specific. I had said ice cream, and I had mentioned it specifically. Now, when you go there, and my brother says, actually, he likes ice creams, but he likes cookie dough as well. So now what he's done is he's done an analogy. And his analogy is making my ruling more universal. So when I said ice cream, his analogy is now saying, oh, ice cream and cookie dough. Now, maybe I might be okay with that because I'm not really very fussy about my desserts, right? But the Quran won't be okay with that, because the Quran, remember, the Quran is providing rulings which are timeless and eternal. If the Quran has mentioned something specific, and remember the Quran is definitive, right? So the Quran has definitively and definitely, qat'i, right? Definitive, definite, we mentioned in the previous section, we mentioned it means qat'i. The Quran has definitively said that it wants the ruling in this specific thing, or the ruling applies to this specific thing. Now, you bring something else and try and make that more general. You can only do that if you have a similar definitive source, definitive, definite source. So if the Quran says elsewhere, oh yeah, this also applies, right? Then that can also, then only then can you make the ruling more general or make it more specific or change that ruling in any way. So to summarize, anything khas, anything specific mentioned in the Quran has to be left in its specificity. The ruling has to be taken according to a specific way that it has been mentioned, or it has to be taken it has to apply to that specific thing, and it can't be made more general, and it can't be changed or made more specific or anything. Nothing like that can happen unless you have divine, definite evidence. That's the first ruling. So when I said you can't specify it further, so if I said to you, go and get me an ice cream, and you took my brother as well, and my brother said, oh, you have to get him sprinkles as well. He has to have sprinkles on there. Well, no, I said, get me an ice cream. I didn't say, get me an ice cream with sprinkles. I didn't add that extra specificity. So you can't force that unless you have divine. So that's what you call specifying. Now, in the Quran, if the Quran had said, a ruling and made it specific, now you can't now bring other things making it more specific or change the qualities, etc. And we'll look at that more in future lessons, inshallah, about unrestricted versus restricted words. That's coming. But anyway, you understand the ruling of specific, khas, specific. Now, that's specific. We also have a rule, a principle for when the Quran mentions universal things. So, if the Quran had mentioned something universal, right, then we also have a rule. So, let's move on to universals. Now, if I said, so just as an example, if I'd said, get me a dessert, right? So now dessert is universal, but ice cream is specific, right? Now, I can also, now if you have a universal, you can specify universals, right? So I can say, get me a dessert, but don't get me cookie dough. Now that's an example of a universal which is part specified. And the reason I've gone into this is because if you have a universal in the Quran, universals can be part specified or they can be left universal. So there's two types of what we call universal statements which are universal. So in the Quran, something which is universal and left universal, that has a different principle associated to it, and something which is universal which has been part specified, that has a different principle associated to it. So let's go over the first one first. An a universal in the Quran from which nothing has been specified. So the ruling of that is that everything associated to that universal thing must be included without exception. So the ruling must apply to every single object, every single thing which is included in that universal. So if I said, get me a dessert, then you're allowed to get me anything included within the word dessert. So the word dessert, which is universal, any type of anything included in that universal category, you're allowed to get me that, right? For the ruling to be valid, right? So I say, get me a dessert, you're allowed to get me anything within the word dessert. Now, if you went to the shop and the dessert shop, and you went and you were going to get me a cookie dough, and my brother was there with you, and he said, actually, no, you can't get him cookie dough, he doesn't like cookie dough, right? Now, the ruling is that in order for you to be able to specify, so now again, he's done an analogy, or well, he's not really done an analogy, it's his own source, he's another source, right? Now, my brother is not a stronger source as me. So for me, if I give you a ruling, I'm the definitive source, right? I definitely told you I want dessert. Now, my brother is a speculative source now. He's telling you, actually, no, you can't get cookie dough. He doesn't like cookie dough. Now, the ruling for the Quran, when the Quran mentions something universal, which has been left universal, if something else comes to try and restrict, or not restrict, it tries to specify that universal, then it's not allowed unless you basically, to specify a universal, you need another definitive source. So my brother, being a speculative source in this case, wouldn't be able to specify my universal statement. Now, I could have said that a lot more succinctly, and I do apologize for that. So just to summarize one more time what we've done so far. You have words in the Quran which are specific, and words in the Quran, or rulings in the Quran, or sentences in the Quran in which a ruling is mentioned pertaining to something specific. Now the ruling for that is, in order to change that ruling or not change the ruling, but make that ruling apply more universally or specify that ruling further, you're going to need a definitive definite source, right? And then you have rulings in the Quran or sentences in the Quran in which the ruling refers to something universal, right, which has been left universal. Now the ruling there is that you can't specify that universal. You can't make that universal refer to less things. So if a universal desserts, you can't say desserts minus this thing, desserts minus these things. That's called specification. Now you can't specify a universal mentioned as universal in the Quran unless you have another similarly definitive source, right? So it's all about how strong is your specifier, how strong is your contradictory source. So in the example I gave, I'm the definitive source because I'm the one that told you the ruling. My brother is a speculative source, so he can't change my ruling. For both of these, for universals and for specifics and for universals. Now the third type is slightly different. The third type is universals which have already been part accepted, part exempted, part specified, right? So for example, that's the example of I tell you, go get me a dessert, but don't get me cookie dough because I don't like cookie dough, right? Whether I said I don't like cookie dough or not. Now let's say I told you, go and get me a dessert, but don't get me cookie dough. Now you go with my brother and you go and you decide to get me a hot fudge sundae. My brother tells you, no, you can't get him a hot fudge sundae because he didn't want a cookie dough because he didn't want a hot dessert, and a hot fudge sundae is also a hot dessert, so you can't get me, so don't get him a hot fudge sundae, right? Now again, he's done analogy, right? My brother is a speculative source and he's using a speculative method of deriving rulings, which is analogy. So what he's done is he said, okay, so he didn't want a cookie dough because it's a hot dessert. So what other hot desserts? He shouldn't want other hot desserts as well. Now what he's done is he's now applied speculative reasoning to come up with, to try and specify the ruling. So my ruling was, get me a dessert but don't get me cookie dough. He's saying don't get me cookie dough and don't get me hot fudge sundae. Don't get him cookie dough, don't get him hot fudge sundae. Now over here he's allowed, he's allowed to specify the ruling, right? Because universals which are part accepted, part specified already. So the Quran, if the Quran said a universal and it already specified from there something, now this is over here, everything within that universal now also becomes speculative because the Quran's already specified something. So trying to switch between the Quranic example and my example is, confusing me a bit. So I told you, get me a dessert, but don't get me cookie dough. Now the question comes, why doesn't he want cookie dough? Does the ruling for which he's exempted and specified cookie dough apply to anything else within desserts? Right? So I said I want desserts, but don't get me cookie dough. Okay, but what about this then? There must have been a reason why you didn't want cookie dough. Does that reason apply to anything else? Now there's speculation, right? Now everything else becomes speculative. It's no longer definitive, right? Now you can question whether the other rulings within that apply or not. So now when my brother comes with his analogy as a speculative source, that speculative source is now strong enough, or the speculative source is able in this case to specify the ruling. Now I know I've not given any Quranic examples. That will come in the next part. The reason why is because the Quranic examples given are quite complicated sometimes. So I wanted to just explain the ruling with my own example, my ice cream example. Inshallah, you understand with that. I'm just going to quickly summarize before we get onto the rulings. So just to summarize then, when we look at the Quran, we derive there are these principles, and these principles fall into four main categories. And the first category that we're looking at today is in terms of the linguistic designation, or in linguistically, what do these words refer to, or what does the ruling refer to in the sentence. So that's bi'tibar al-wad'. And so the first principle is to do with words that the Quran has mentioned in a very specific way. The Quran has mentioned a ruling referring to something specific. The ruling for that is that you have to keep the ruling to that specific thing. You're not allowed to generalize it. You're not allowed to make it more universal. You're not allowed to specify it, right? Unless you have a definitive, definite source, because that's how, if this one was unless you have a definitive, definite source, because then they're both equal, and you can deal with those two sources. But if you don't have something as strong as the Quran, i.e. definitive and definite, then you're not allowed to specify it. So the example of that was, bring me a ice cream, then you can't say, oh, you can bring him ice cream and cookie dough, and you can't say bring him ice cream and you have to bring him sprinkles as well on that ice cream, right? No, you can bring me any ice cream as long as it's ice cream, because my ruling, what I mentioned to you was specific. So that was specific. Then you can have universals. So if the Quran has mentioned a ruling referring to something which is universal, i.e. it contains many specific things within it, a universal category of specific things, right? Then the ruling of that is that the ruling has to apply to everything included within that category. So if I said to you, bring me a dessert, you're allowed to get me anything which counts as a dessert. You can't say, nobody can come to you and say, this doesn't count or this doesn't count, or because that would be specifying what I've left universal. The Quran has left it universal, then it refers to everything that the Quran mentioned. It refers to everything included within that universal. So you can't specify that. You can't specify that universal unless you have a definitive, definite source specifying it. So that's the second one. And the third one are rulings mentioned in the Quran which refer to universal things which have already been part specified. So the Quran's mentioned it universal and then part specified it itself. Now, over there, the ruling for that is you can have a speculative source to specify that further. So over there, you don't need another definitive source. You can use less established sources, not less established. You can use less sources which are not at the ultimate strength, basically. Sources which are slightly more speculative. You can use a speculative source, right? Again, the speculative source can still be strong, but we're just calling it speculative because it's not definitive. A source which is speculative can specify these types of universals, which are already part specified. So that's the summary. So the example there was, I say, get me a dessert, but don't get me cookie dough. Then if my brother came to you and said, actually, don't get him a cookie dough, and, don't get him a fudge as well, because, fudge and cookie dough are similar, then, or fudge and, they're both hot desserts and he doesn't want hot desserts. He uses that and an analogical reasoning, which is a speculative source. Then, he can do that, and that will count. Then if you then come and get me a hot fudge sundae, and I said, but I didn't want a hot fudge sundae, and you said, but you didn't say, but my brother told you, why didn't you listen to him? So that in that case, if the Quran had mentioned a ruling like that, then that's how we would deal with it. We would say that a speculative source can specify. Okay, so let's go on to some examples. So first of all, first example, وَلْيَطَّوَّفُوا بِالْبَيْتِ الْعَتِيقِ, that do tawaf, go around the, tawaf. Everyone knows what tawaf is, right? Going around the Kaaba 7 times in Hajj or Umrah, that is tawaf. So go around the sacred house. So is that specific, universal, universal, part specified. Which one is it? What's the ruling there? Right? I'll tell you this one because this one is a bit complicated. Well, this is the first example, and that's why it's not complicated. So this is specific. The Quran has mentioned, so it's talking about Hajj. So in Hajj, do tawaf. وَلْيَطَّوَّفُوا بِالْبَيْتِ الْعَتِيقِ. Do tawaf. It's being specific. Do tawaf. Right? Because tawaf is a reference to something specific. Right? Tawaf doesn't include other things. It's not a universal. It's a specific. So if the Quran has specifically mentioned do tawaf, now you can't then generalize this ruling. And you can't specify it further unless you have a definitive source. Okay, so why did I bring this specific example? Because we have other sources of evidence which seem to try and specify this. So we have other sources which say you have to have wudu when you do tawaf in Hajj, right? So can we add this additional specificity? Can we make this more specified that when you do Hajj you have to do tawaf and you have to have wudu while you do that tawaf? You're now specifying further. Now you have to look at this other source. Is this other source definitive? If this other source is definitive, we can specify. However, in our case, this other source is not definitive. This other source is a speculative source. So we'd say no. You can do tawaf, and we're not going to add wudu as this condition. Right? However, those of you who know a bit of fiqh know that you do have to have wudu. So, what we're saying then? No, we're saying that the fard of Hajj. So, in Hajj, tawaf al-ziyarah is fard. Now, if you do tawaf al-ziyarah without wudu or without ghusl, etc., now, does that invalidate your Hajj? That's the question. We would say no, it doesn't. Because wudu and purity, tahara, was not a condition. Was not because the Quran was specific in saying that you have to do tawaf, and the Quran, you can't now additionally specify that. However, because this other source that we have to say that you have to be pure while doing tawaf, right? Because that is quite strong still, right? It's still speculative. It's not definitive. It's strong, but it's still speculative, right? But because it's strong, we still need to give that some consideration. So we'll say, okay, we'll make it wajib. So to do tawaf is fard. So in Hajj, if you don't do tawaf, your Hajj is invalid. But if you do tawaf and you didn't have this condition of doing it in the state of purity, then we'll say your Hajj is complete, but it's sort of imperfect. And in order to then rectify that, you have to give sadaqah, or you have to give adam, or you have to give budana, or whatever, right? You have to do this additional compensation. So just to recap that example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do tawaf, right? And so we know that the Quran has mentioned part of your Hajj, it is necessary to do tawaf. That's the ruling. And the Quran was specific and it mentioned tawaf. Now we can't then specify that further or make it more universal unless we have a definitive evidence. Now, what sort of other evidences do we have contradicting this maybe? We have this source of evidence which is speculative, which says that you need to have wudu as well. So how do we deal with this situation? Well, we say that actually you can't make that a necessary component of your Hajj because the verse is already specific. The verse is already specific, we can't specify it further. But because this source is still sufficiently strong, even though it's still speculative, we can make it necessary but a lower level of necessity. We can say it's not fard but it's wajib. So if you don't do this, if you don't have tahara, if you don't have purity during your tawaf, right, your Hajj is complete but it's imperfect. And in order to rectify your Hajj, you will need to do this additional compensation of paying a sadaqah or a budana, or you're gonna have to do a dam, a slaughter, in order to rectify this problematic thingy. But your Hajj would technically be done, right? In terms of completing the fara'id, the necessities of your Hajj, it will still be done. Okay, that was the first example. Let's move on to the second example. The second example وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوءٍ. So the Quran says the divorced woman must wait for 3 quru. So she must wait by herself for 3 quru. So what's this a ruling of? For those of you that know, this is the duration of iddah. So a woman who gets divorced, a woman who is divorced by her husband, she has to perform this waiting period. That's what the Quran says, right? That she has to then wait this waiting period before she can marry again. And the duration of that waiting period is 3 quru. So the ruling here is that the divorced woman must wait for 3 quru. So what is this? Is this specific? Is this universal? Is this part specified universal? Which category is it? I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. Okay, if you said specific, you are correct, because the Quran specifically says 3 quru, right? It's specific in that it has to be 3, right? It can't be anything else. This is not a universal term, right? There's no other options here within the word 3 quru that we can take. 3 quru is something specific that the Quran's mentioned in related to the ruling of waiting. So, okay, so 3 quru. Great. We'll tell the divorced woman to wait 3 quru. What does that mean? Well, now again, these examples are chosen specifically because there's some kind of contradiction. Not contradiction, there's some kinds of opposing evidences here, right? Or some kind of discussion within the fuqaha, some kind of disagreement. So what's the issue here? Now the issue here is that quru, the word quru, quru, it can actually mean 2 things. It can mean either hayd or it can mean tuhr. It can mean purity or it can mean purity or menstruation. Now a woman's menstrual cycle, she goes through menstruations and she'll go through purities. So the question is, and this word quru can refer to both of them. Now which one are we going to take? Because they're both equal in terms of, they both are equal. You have equal possibility of taking both. So now we're going to use the khas of the Quran, right? So the Quran was specific when it mentioned 3. Now that means that it can't be 0, it can't be 1, it can't be 2, it can't be 4, it can't be 5. You get the idea. But also it can't be 2.5, can't be 3.5. It has to be exactly 3. So let's look at this. Let's look at an example scenario, right? So the Quran, so a man divorced his wife, hypothetically, divorced his wife in a purity, because the Sharia says that you're not allowed to divorce your wife during a menstruation. You have to divorce your wife during purity. It's not permissible to divorce your wife outside of a purity in a menstruation, right? And again, if a person does do that, then the rules of fiqh explain what happens in that case, but basically the divorce will still happen, but he's sinful and etc. But the way that a divorce is, a divorce should only happen in purity. So halfway through this hypothetical woman's purity, this hypothetical husband of hers gave her this hypothetical divorce. So when will her waiting period end? So let's start with looking at quru as purities. So she has half of the first purity left, because he divorced her halfway through this purity. So half of the first purity is left. Then the first menstruation happens. Then she has another whole purity. So at the end of this whole purity, how many purities has she completed? Half of the first one and a second one. Or well, half of the first one and another whole one. So 1.5. Then she'll go through a second menstruation and then another purity. So now it's 2.5 purities, a third menstruation, and then another purity. Well, so is it at the beginning of that purity, the end of that purity, or halfway through that purity? How do we deal with this? Now, if you say the beginning of that purity, then she's only done 2.5 purities. If she does the end of that purity, it's 3.5 purities, right? So if you take quru to mean purity, then it's going to be either 2.5 or 3.5. You're not going to be able to get the Quranic understanding of 3. And if you take, now you're probably thinking, okay, but why can't he just say, oh, half the purity? So her other purity was 25 days, and so we'll take 13.5 days. After 13.5 days, but that's all very vague, because purities aren't necessarily always the same size, and it gets a bit complicated and it gets a bit confusing. What if the purity that she was divorced in was 25 days long, and then after that, that third purity ended up becoming 45 days long? So then what happens after 13.5 days? How does she know it's a half? So she's going to have to wait until the end of that purity. It gets a bit complicated and muddled. So you know you can't really base a ruling on that. But if we take haid, if we take menstruations, so then the husband divorces his wife halfway through this purity, she finishes that half a purity, then the first menstruation, another purity, second menstruation, another purity, third menstruation, she's done, right? Because the husband should not be divorcing his wife in a menstruation anyway, right? And then you're probably thinking, those of you who are, insatiable uh, questioners like me, because obviously I had this question when I first learned this. Okay, but what if the husband does, right? And he'll be sinful, but obviously the divorce still happens. So when's her waiting period going to finish? So the books of fiqh will discuss that, and technically this is not, we're not here to discuss that, but just to satisfy your insatiable curiosity, um, we will basically, from what I recall, and I could be wrong here, in fact I'm not going to say it, but I think the first that purity doesn't, that menstruation doesn't count, and she has to do 3 new ones. But I could be wrong. But anyway, the scholars of fiqh will discuss these scenarios. But the point is, he wasn't allowed to do that. He'll be sinful for doing that. So in the normal case where the husband does the divorce in the way that he was supposed to do the divorce, right? Well then, menstruations makes the most sense. So that's what we're going to take. And of course, there are other reasons and explanations and evidences that the scholars who that the Hanafi scholars who take this position have also used. This is the only reason we mentioned it here, is just to give an example of something specific in the Quran and how that has been used. So, just to summarize, وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوءٍ. The divorced woman must wait for 3 quru. Now this is the ruling of the waiting period, how long the waiting period is, right? It's 3 quru. So this verse is specific in that the woman has to wait 3 quru. So the Quran is being specific here. Now you can't generalize this, you make it more universal, or add additional specificity unless you have another definitive source. So when we have quru, quru can mean both purity and menstruation. So which one do we use? Well, if you're going to use the word, if you're going to take the meaning of purity, well then you're going to have to generalize and make more universal this understanding of 3 quru, right? Because it's going to be 2.5 or 3.5, or it's going to be 2 3/4 and 3 3/4, or 2 and 7 days and 3 and 7 days, right? It will never be exactly 3 if you take the definition of quru to be purity, right? And of course, this is assuming that the husband has not disobeyed the Sharia by divorcing his wife in a menstruation. Anyway, so because of that, it makes much more sense for us to take the meaning of menstruation to as quru. Okay, so that's 2 examples done. Let's now look at some other examples. Inna Allah bi kulli shay'in alim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is well aware and most knowledgeable of everything. So what is that? Is this a specific, is this ruling referring to something specific? Is this ruling referring to something universal, or something universal which has been past specified? So let's actually start with what's the ruling here. The ruling here is, it's kind of a ruling of belief. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all aware of everything, right? So we must now believe that Allah is, again, this is not a practical legal ruling. This is technically a ruling of creed, a ruling of theology, a ruling of aqidah, right? Where we have to believe it's a ruling of something we have to believe in. It's not a practical legal ruling, if you remember from the first lesson. But anyway, it's still something it's still a ruling that we can that we can extract from the Quran. That's why this example has been given. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being knowledgeable of everything is something that we have to believe in. Now, it is universal because the words everything, kullu shay, every single thing, right? So that word everything is universal. It includes everything. It's the most universal word we can find. So we have to establish Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being most knowledgeable of everything contained, or all the things contained within this word everything. So this universal word everything, whatever is included in that, Allah's knowledge is associated to that. And the ruling is that we have to believe that. So you now can't specify this to say that Allah's knowledge is associated to the things contained within this universal, with the exception of these few things. You can't do that unless you have another divine source. You have another definitive source to specify that, right? So hopefully that was a pretty easy example. So everything is universal, right? So we must believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge is associated to all the things contained within that universal without exception. And unless, if we want to specify that, to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything but these things, then we're going to need a definitive source to establish that, which doesn't exist. And so we have to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows about everything, right? This is a ruling of theology, belief, etc. So let's move on to the next one. فَقْرَؤُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ. That you must recite whatever is easy from the Quran. Recite whatever is easy from the Quran. What is this? A universal or a specific? This is universal. Whatever is easy is a universal, right? Which contain universal. It includes anything that is easy within the Quran, right? So because of that, the Quran is saying you're allowed to recite anything that is easy from the Quran in your salah. So the ruling is, in your salah, for the validity of your salah, you must have some recitation, and that recitation can include anything that is easy from the Quran, right? So now you can't specify this and say that actually in your salah you must recite something specific, that you can recite whatever is easy, but you can't recite this, or you must recite this and whatever is easy, or you can't specify this ruling. You're allowed to recite whatever is easy. So anything easy from the Quran that you recite should be permissible in your salah, should make your salah valid. It should validate the recitation portion. The condition of reciting in your salah will be validated by the recitation of anything easy. Now, we've also got a hadith which says La salata illa bi fatihatil kitab, that there is no salah except with the surah Fatiha of the kitab, of the Quran, that every single salah must have the surah Fatiha recited. Now, this hadith is a speculative source, and I've not covered this yet, so we'll just do an aside here, take a short detour to explain this. Now, this hadith might be sahih, right? But it's not definite knowledge, because unless the hadith has been narrated in a similar mutawatir, contiguous way, it is not a source of definite knowledge, right? As I remember when we defined what definite knowledge is, it has to be something which is absolutely certain. When I say absolutely certain, it must have been transmitted from us in from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a source of certain knowledge, it must have been transmitted from him in a certain way, in which there's so many chains that it's impossible to conceive any error or anything, right? There's now hadith, even sahih hadiths, right? Even sahih hadiths are not definite knowledge, right? And again, this is not a criticism of hadith, right? It's just compared to the Quran, hadiths are not going to be as certain. Every single hadith is not going to be as certain, right? And that's not to say that we shouldn't look at hadith at all. No, hadith are then categorized as speculative evidences, and there's a different way we deal with them. We still deal with hadiths, right? Hadiths are very important. As I said, remember, we said that tawaf has to be done with wudu, otherwise you have to pray. We still considered it, we made it wajib. So we're still taking the hadith, right, in the tawaf example. So over here, this hadith, there's no salah except with Surah Fatiha. Now that seems to be contradicting, that seems to be trying to specify what the Quran has made universal. The Quran has said universally that anything easy from the Quran can be recited in salah. This hadith is saying, no, you have to recite Surah Fatiha, and then you can recite something else, right? So, how do we deal with this? Well, we're not going to specify the Quran. So this is a speculative source. So you can't specify what's general and universal in the Quran. You can't specify what's universal in the Quran with the speculative source. So, in order for your salah to be valid, you can recite anything. But you still have to recite Surah Fatiha, because we made Surah Fatiha wajib. We say with this, so this hadith, it was speculative. Now, while that's not enough to say that your salah would be invalid without reciting Surah Fatiha, we can say that your salah with Surah Fatiha will be complete. But so your salah with Surah Fatiha will be complete, but it will be imperfect. And because it's imperfect, we will say that if you don't recite Surah Fatiha in your salah, you'll have to do a sajda sahwa, the sajdas of forgetfulness, the prostrations of forgetfulness. So if you've made a mistake in your prayer and you've left out a wajib, we'll say that your salah is incomplete, and it has to be repeated even though it's complete, right? Because it's been is imperfect, not incomplete. Though it's complete, it's imperfect, and so you should repeat it if you can. Again, I'm not here to give fiqh rulings. This you'll understand in your furu' fiqh, furu' fiqh course, furu' fiqh module that you're doing, right? I'm just here to explain that because this hadith does not reach the same, is not definitive, right? Like the verse of the Quran is, and the Quran left this universal. So we can't specify what's left universal in the Quran with this speculative source, right? But because this hadith is still strong, we'll still consider it in a different way. We'll consider it by saying that it's still wajib. It's still necessary, but slightly less compulsory. It's still necessary to recite Surah Fatiha, but if you don't recite Surah Fatiha in your prayer will technically be valid, right? But it will be imperfect, and so you'll have to do an expiation effectively. This is how we deal with fiqh. This is how we deal with these types of contradictions. It's a very nice, inclusive, holistic system that we have in the Hanafi madhab. I know that we've been going on for quite a while in this third recording, so I'll try and run through this final example quite quickly. وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made trade halal and riba haram. So what is this? He has permitted trade and prohibited riba. This is an example of something universal which has been part specified. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted trade. Trade is a universal. It includes many different types of trades, right? So you can trade buy now, pay later. So that's on credit, that's a different type of trade. You can barter where there's no money involved, that's a different type of trade. You can trade by, giving gold for silver, that's a different type of trade. There's various different types of trades, And Quran is saying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted trade. It's universal. But He has prohibited riba. And riba is a type of trade, right? So if I give you £1,000 and you give me £1,500 back, right? That is a type of trade. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is specifying this. He has said that this type of trade is not allowed. So this is a universal, and part of it has been specified. Part of it has been excluded from the ruling that applies to that universal. So now, what do we do with this? This means that this universal, which has been past specified, we can have other sources. We can have other non-definitive sources. Also, we can have speculative sources which can specify this further. It's allowed. You don't need a definitive source to specify this further, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited riba. He's already excluded something. That implies that there's a reason that He's excluded this, and that reason may also apply to other things in there, right? That there could be other reasons to exclude certain things from this as well, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already given us a precedent for excluding certain things from this universal. So now we can exclude other things, and we don't need such a strong source, such a definitive source to specify. We can use speculative sources. So for example, there are hadith which say that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibits bay'un wa shartun, a trade with a condition attached, or two transactions in one, right? So two transactions in one is like when you say, I'll buy your house on the condition that you sell my car. Sorry, I'll buy your house on the condition that you buy my car. Two transactions in one. One's conditional upon the other, right? So so the scholars have said that that's not allowed based on this hadith. Now you would say that, but that's specifying this verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted trade. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permitting trade, He's already exempted from it. And once you've exempted from it already, this universal becomes part specified, and you're allowed to use speculative sources to specify further. So that's why we have other trades which are also prohibited. And just one final point. This final one that we mentioned is an example where the specified thing is unknown, right? Because riba technically isn't defined in the Quran. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has excluded something which is not really explained in the Quran, right? But it's explained in the Sunnah, right? So that you can basically, the Mabadil Usul, what the book is saying is that you can have that, right? You can have that where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains something, explains a universal and part specifies something, and doesn't explain what the part specified thing is. That's left to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to explain what riba was. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam explained what riba was in a hadith in which he mentioned that, gold with gold and silver with silver, that hadith, etc. You'll understand, you'll learn that in your Furuq Fiqh course. This is not the purpose of this here, right? And again, this last point isn't actually very important, but it was mentioned in the book, so I thought, I'm not going to do a disservice to you guys by skipping something that was mentioned in the book. Okay, just to summarize now, I know I've taken up a lot of your time already. This first lesson ended up, becoming a bit long because it was the initial concepts that we were explaining. So I'll make the summary a bit shorter. I've already summarized that key points within the lesson anyway. So inshallah, that should help you. Obviously, I'm not going to summarize in as much detail as maybe I did yesterday in the previous lesson. Okay, so we started off by talking about the Kitabullah and defining the Kitabullah. We said that the Kitabullah is the Quran. We defined the Kitabullah as the Quran which was revealed upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was recorded in the Mus'hafs by the Sahaba, and it was then transmitted to us in a unbroken, continuous, contiguous transmission in which there was no possibility of error. So that was the definition of Kitabullah. Then we explained how the Quran is a source of definitive rulings. This makes the Quran a definitive and definite source for rulings, right? And it's not speculative like other sources of rulings. And then we talked about how to derive rulings from the Quran, and we mentioned that today we're going to be focusing specifically on the linguistic understanding. So linguistically, what has the Quran, or linguistically, the way the ruling is mentioned, so in a sentence where a ruling is mentioned, the linguistic method that the Quran used to explain that ruling, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used to explain that ruling, what do we understand from that in regards to the ruling? How do how do we how does the ruling change based on the type of wording that was used, or the linguistic understanding of the wording that was used? So in the first principle was to do with words used that are specific. If the Quran has purposefully used a word which was linguistically referring to something specific, then the ruling must, then basically that ruling has to be limited to that specific thing. That ruling has then you're not allowed to make that more universal, and you're not allowed to make that more universal or more specific than how the Quran has mentioned it without a definitive source. And then for a universal, if the Quran has mentioned something universal and he has left it universal, then likewise you can't specify something that the Quran has linguistically left universal unless you bring a source which is also what's it called? Which is also definitive, which is also definitive knowledge. So you can't specify a universal that the Quran has mentioned unless you have another source which is as strong as the Quran, i.e., it is definitive. You can't use a speculative source to make universal a specific, or to specify a universal. And then when you have a universal which has already been part specified by the Quran, then you can't, then you're allowed, then you don't have the same condition. You can use a non-definitive source, a speculative source, to specify that universal further if you want. And then we went through various examples. So the first example was وَلْيَطَّوَّفُوا بِالْبَيْتِ الْعَتِيقِ, do tawaf around the house. So we said that this verse, do tawaf, is specific, right? The Quran has mentioned the ruling in this specific way of do tawaf, so you can't make that more specific by adding this condition of wudu or tahara or purity based on this other speculative source that we have. So you can't specify this ruling that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already made specific. So we'll say that wudu, etc., is necessary but not compulsory. So not having wudu will not invalidate your hajj. Doing tawaf without wudu will not invalidate your hajj, right? But you will still have to compensate for it, because we still take that source in some vein, right? Then we mentioned وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوء, that the woman, the divorced woman, the woman who has been divorced must wait for 3 quru. So this is defining the waiting period. And we said that quru, so this verse is specific to 3 quru. This verse has specifically mentioned 3 quru, right? So now you can't make this more universal to 2.5 or 3.5 or whatever. You have to abide by that specificness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned of 3 quru. And so where does this come in? The word quru can mean either hayd or tuhr. It can either mean menstruation or purity. If you take the word purity, then you're not going to get exactly 3, you're going to get 2.5 or 3.5, or you're going to get some vagueness in the exact number. And so we're going to have to taking the meaning of menstruation allows us that exact 3. So we'll take the word quru to mean menstruation, and that will mean that we're not specifying the Quran. Then we looked at example of Inna Allah bikulli shay'in alim. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all aware of everything. The ruling from there is we need to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge is associated to everything that's contained within this universal. So kullu shay, everything, is a universal. And so you can't specify that. You can't exclude things from that. You can't exclude things from Allah's knowledge. In this case, the ruling is Allah's knowledge applying to everything. You can't exclude things from that universal unless you have a definitive source of knowledge. this definitive source, excluding things from Allah's knowledge, doesn't exist, and so the ruling must remain on its universal. So we have to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all aware of everything without exception. And then فَقْرَؤُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ, recite whatever is easy from the Quran. So whatever is easy is unspecified, it is universal, so we have to abide by that universal. So when we have this hadith, لا صلاة إلا بفاتحة الكتاب, there is no prayer except with Surah Fatiha also recited. Well, that's specifying, because that's saying that you have to recite Surah Fatiha. So that's specifying what the Quran has left universal. That's not allowed because this hadith is a speculative source, right? So we'll say that the validity of salah, the validity of prayer, is just recitation, right? Whatever is easy from the Quran, right? And we'll say that this condition of reciting Surah Fatiha will make that a wajib, will make that necessary, but not a condition for the validity of the prayer. So if you miss out Surah Fatiha, your prayer will be valid, but it will be imperfect, and therefore you must expiate for that imperfection by doing a sajda of forgetfulness. And then the final example, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted all types of trade, universal, all types of trade, but He's excluded riba. Riba is, but He has prohibited riba. So now there's this universal trade which has been permitted, and He's excluded riba from that universal and said that that's prohibited. So this is a universal that's been part excluded, part specified, and so we can specify this further by using a speculative source. So for example, we have hadiths which mention other types of trade that are also prohibited, so we can specify, we can say that we can prohibit these other types of trades using those speculative sources, even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned it universally here, because He has also part specified it. And the ruling of universals that are part specified is that you can use a speculative source to specify them, even though the specified thing in this case isn't defined by the Quran, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't specifically mention in the Quran that what riba is. We have to go to the sunnah for that, right? And again, so despite the fact that our definition of our definition of riba is from a speculative source, the fact is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still excluded it, which means that it's still something part excluded. It's still the exclusion is still definitive. And we can understand from the sunnah, as I said, exactly what that refers to. So that is the lesson today. It was a bit complicated, as the first lesson of usul always is. Inshallah, the coming principles that we'll do in the next lessons will not be as difficult as this one, and added to that is the difficulty of this being the first principle you've learned. Inshallah, I've tried to explain it in a way which hopefully made sense, and pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses you and your families and grants us all ilmun nafi', inshallah.